Welcome, everybody. We have today the Broadmoor Haiku Collective with a special slideshow and haiku reading. And I will turn it over to Paul Miller first to introduce the group. I think everyone here knows Paul very well as the editor of Modern Haiku, but his truly important job for us is HPNC treasurer, which he's been doing for quite a long time. Thank you, Paul. So I will turn it over to you. And before we, yes, I'll mute everybody, and then everyone who is a part of the presentation group, please unmute yourselves. There. Okay, Paul.
Okay, thank you. This is wonderful. This kind of coming together of really two of my favorite haiku groups. As most of you know, I joined HPNC probably in, I think, the late 1990s when I lived in San Francisco, and my writing really flourished with its involvement. And of late, of course, I've really enjoyed my involvement with the Broadmoor group. And as you'll learn, I've been able to kind of take it with me in a fashion as I've moved down to Florida for retirement. So Haiku from Home. As you'll learn, this presentation illustrates our group's move from in-person meetings to, due to COVID, online meetings. And like our meetings, this is an ongoing document. So if you saw a previous iteration, as Sue mentioned, of this presentation, you'll notice some new stuff in this one. We've broken today's presentation into three pieces. Hannah is going to give a bit of the history of the Broadmoor group and how we came to ultimately interact over Zoom. Then she's going to run the presentation itself, in which you'll see the various writing prompts we used, and then read and hear the response poems from the various members. After that, Judson is going to speak about the process of writing the prompts and some of the challenges we all faced. And then if there's time, we'll happily answer any questions, but I do know people probably want to, potentially get to other things today. So before we begin, I'd like to introduce the members of the Broadmoor Haiku Collective. When I mention your name, if you could just say hi so folks can get a glimpse of you. And we'll start with Brad.
Hey, everybody.
So Brad Bennett is an elementary school teacher who lives near Boston. He started writing haiku seriously a little over 10 years ago and has published 2 books of haiku. The first, A Drop of Pond, won a 2016 Touchstone Award from the Haiku Foundation. And the second, A Turn in the River, was published in 2019. He has taught haiku to children and adults in a variety of settings, and he's very grateful for haiku in his life. If you're interested in buying a copy of Brad's most recent books, I'll let him put ordering information into the chat section of this presentation. And actually, I'll say that to all the presenters. If you're interested, just please put your information there. Another member of our group, Ellen Bridges, will unfortunately not be able to join us today. I will read his haiku during the presentation. Alan began his haiku journey on a cross-country train trip where he met John Stevenson. Alan has won multiple haiku contests, and he's been voted Poet of the Year twice by the readers of the Heron's Nest. He worked as a patient services representative at a small hospital in Concord, Massachusetts, and his first full-length haiku collection, In the Curves, was published by Red Moon Press in 2020. Judson, you want to say hi?
Hi, everybody. Nice to be here.
Judson Evans is a full-time professor of liberal arts at the Berklee College of Music, where he teaches poetry workshops focusing on haiku, haibun, and renku, and a visual studies course on Paleolithic cave art. He is a longstanding member of the HSA and a 30-year member of the Boston Haiku Society. He published a book of haibun, Mortal Coil, through Leap Press in 2005, and his haibun are represented in 2 Redmond anthologies, in Bruce Ross's Journeys to the Interior, American Versions of Haibun, and in Journeys 2017, which is an anthology of international haibun edited by Angeli Diodar. His collaborative book of lyric poems, responding to cave paintings, Chalk Song, will be published by Boston's Lily Press in the fall of 2021. He recently became co-editor of Haibun for Frog Pond. Kristen.
Hey, everybody.
Kristen Lindquist is a writer and a nature birding guide who lives in Camden, Maine. She's been a member of the Broadmoor Haiku Collective for over a year. She has published 2 full-length collections of free verse poetry. Her haiku chapbook, It Always Comes Back, was the winner of the 2020 Snapshot Press eChapbook Award and will be published, I presume, shortly. Is that right?
Who knows?
Who knows? Okay.
Sometime this year, hopefully.
He is faster. Yes, John is much faster with ebooks than he is with our regular books. And then Hannah.
Hi, everyone.
Hannah Mahoney lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and works in children's publishing. Her haiku and free verse have appeared in a variety of print and online journals, and she is recipient of the Kazuyasu International Haiku Award, as well as the Kazuyasu Senryu Award. Jeannie Martin, I believe, is with us on the phone today, but I don't believe we can see her. I think she was having connection problems. So one of the other ladies will be reading her parts today. Jeannie is a haiku poet, a teacher, and a retreat leader. She is the author of 11 haiku chapbooks, 2 with Haibun. Her haiku have been published in a variety of journals and anthologies. She teaches and shares haiku with marginalized populations, including the incarcerated and the homeless. And she also brings haiku as an expressive arts teacher to nursing homes and memory care programs. I think we already mentioned me. I'm Paul Miller. I live in Inlet Beach, Florida. I've been writing haiku for a little over 25 years under the pseudonym Paul M. My latest collection, Witness Tree, was just published by Snapshot Press, and it recently won a Touchstone Award from the Haiku Foundation. Tom Sacramona, he will not be able to join us today as well, but 2 of his haiku have received honorable mentions in the Kazuyasu Haiku Contest, and others have appeared as favorites in the Turtle Light Press Haiku Contest. He is going to be a featured reader at the 8th Annual Haiku Gathering this August. He is currently the editor of Frog Pond, and Brad Bennett will be reading his poems today. Mary.
Buddy, thanks for having us.
Mary Stevens lives in the Hudson Valley among much wildlife. She won 1st place in the 2020 Henderson Awards and 2nd place in the 2020 Lyles Awards. She's a member of the HSA since 2003. She co-judged the 2013 Virgilio Haiku Contest with John Stevenson and presented The Cicada's Voice, How Wabi Sabi Can Teach Us How to Live at the 2015 HMA in Schenectady. She is the co-editor of the linked verse section of Frog Pond with Alan Bridges and a writer for Haikipedia. She was the featured poet on Cornell University's Man Library Daily webpage for haiku in December 2020 and is included in this year's new Resonance series. Mary was invited to be the 5th member of the Route 9 haiku group and made her debut in the group's journal Upstate Dim Sum with the current issue. She aspires to get out of her own way when writing haiku. So that's the group, that's all of us. I'm now going to turn over to Hannah, and she maybe give us a little bit of history about the group itself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for having us. This is such a treat. Thought we'd just give you a really quick background about our group and the byways it's taken along the way and how we got to where we are. The group owes its spark to the wonderful teaching of Jeannie Martin. In 2013, Lauren Mayhew took a class with her at the Cambridge Center for Adult Ed. And Lauren was really inspired to learn more about haiku and to connect with others. So she and Jeannie did some reaching out, and Lauren, Jeannie, Brad Bennett, and I, along with some other local haiku poets, began meeting in an open group called the Alewife Brook Haiku Group, and we met for a year through 2014. Then Jeannie, Brad, Lauren, and I kind of coalesced into a good quartet, and we began to meet just the 4 of us as the Summer Street Haiku Group, and we met for several years. In 2018, Lauren had stepped away from haiku, and Jeannie, Brad, and I decided to branch out a bit and invite some fellow haiku poets to a ginkgo at Broadmoor Nature Center west of Boston. We all really enjoyed that outing, so we started doing ginkgo once per season at Broadmoor and other places. That was going great. Then the pandemic hit. So we wondered what to do. We started to try transforming our ginkgo into what we quickly came to call Zoomco, meeting monthly. One really nice advantage of meeting via Zoom has been that we could include our friend Mary Stevens from New York, as well as Kristen Lindquist, without her having to make the trek down from Maine. And then, as Paul said, when he moved to Florida, he could still be included. So the main thing we've tried to do is have someone send out a set of photographs in advance of the meeting for us to write from. We then share those haiku together at our meeting, as well as sometimes reading haiku we've recently read and enjoyed, and having a variety of presentations and discussions. We've also tried writing from short nature videos from the website Nature 365, from notes on Japanese micro seasons from the website 72 Seasons, from prose passages, and from short quotations. This month, we're working on some Dutch master paintings, which has been challenging and really interesting. Thank you, Kristen Lindquist. We've learned a lot along the way. Each prompting mode has been challenging in different ways, and the variety has helped keep us engaged. And I think we agree that we've all gotten better at writing this way as we've gone along. For me, through all the turmoil, isolation, and anxiety of the last year, our meetings have been just wonderful little islands of camaraderie, laughter, learning, and engagement around this forum that we all love so much. And I've been enormously appreciative. So yeah, so on to the slideshow. It'll take about 10 or 15 minutes, I think. So let me share my screen. All right, here's us.
Lamplight. A bowl of rainwater for the birds.
Rippling shallows. What matters and what doesn't.
Day moon. Her long sleeves hide the bruises.
Condolence cards. Spent tulips arc beyond the vase.
Blossoming cherry. Even a waxwing's head bowed. Ocean froth. Spidered patterns in battered granite.
We're taken by irises. Abandoned lookout chair.
Widower's walk. An exposed root points home.
Coils of rope inside the rowboat. color of sky.
Coils of rope color the dockyard. Gray fish houses.
Soft serve at the wharf. A sloop coming in on evening wind.
Island farm. The irregular foghorn of goats.
Seaside cottage. Sunset in the square of every window.
Was it night or morning? A warning or delight?
Last firework drifting down. The cool grass.
September sky. The old blue gate left unlatched.
A new latch on the garden gate. Parting clouds.
Roadside shade. A bee visits the basket of peppers. Cliff face. Pines. Point the way.
Bubble machine left on all day. Halos around the sun.
The visiting nurse feels for dampness. Potted amaryllis.
Crossing my arms over my breasts. Winter narcissus. On my new windowsill. Amaryllis again.
The rose hedge. All summer to the vanishing point.
Her studio now stripped to the beams. All sundial.
Vespers. The scent of beeswax.
In her yellow dress, she saunters barefoot into the bar.
Heavy fog. A buoy clangs against the bay.
Dawn fog. Not tethered to anything. A wood duck.
Birch grove. Stripping away the self to find a superhero.
Kingston sunset. The ratio of copper to tin in the church bell.
You can't go in. Fingerprints on our snow globe.
Deep in the frozen harbor. So many secrets. Oil slick. One last rubber glove, waving. Working harbor. The tide's slow progress up the wharf ladder. Brought in with the winter wind. Fragments of trees.
Cracks and crevices. Seeking out a place to anchor myself.
This is our time, a modern time. It's where the haiku can smell of gasoline as opposed to flowers. It will smell of death quite often, as opposed to a life that might be in a stream. It will tell of death of rivers as opposed to someone sitting on a bank fishing. Sonia Sanchez. Tripping over a raccoon's skull. Low day moon.
Numberless as grains of sand. An archipelago of plastic beads.
River fog. The duck decoy's eye. Painted in lead.
You have to learn how to be big and small at the same time. Pema Chodron. Emergency care. He tells a patient the last joke she'll hear.
If you are a good organic gardener, looking at a rose, you can see the garbage. And looking at the garbage, you can see a rose. Thich Nhat Hanh. First grade recess. The future loam of falling leaves.
Calm the heart's dark waters. Collect from deep thoughts the proper names for things. Lucci. Thesaurus. I go back to my original.
Highways of water. The deep blue stripes of a gondolier's shirt. Paw prints in garden mud. Foxglove dew. Bristlecone pine. In one endless twist back to the sky.
Ancient tree trunk. Its shadows come alive.
Even the branches take the shape of flame. Bristlecone pine.
End times. Bristlecone pines twist and shout.
The 100-hander. Where Arius stands guard against an attack of the Titans.
Movement meditation. Starting with my breath, I explore spirals.
Bristlecone pine. After all these years, he still steals the covers.
No more needles. A bristlecone pine wears its wind.
Bristlecone's poor soil. Yet 3,000 years of visiting songbirds. Thanks, everyone. That was very, very nice. Good job, Hannah.
Thank you. Sorry for the false start there.
We're going to edit it out.
Okay, please do.
And now we're going to move on to Judson, who's going to talk a little bit about process.
Yes, so it's been so exciting working with all of these terrific poets over these months, and I think we all had moments when we were really pleasantly surprised at just the surprise of how another poet came to the exact same visual image with a completely different approach. And so I wanted to reflect a little bit about our process and some of the issues involved. And I thought I would start with just the question about the relationship between the haiku and the visual image. I'm going to talk mostly about the visual images. I have a little bit at the end about working with the prose, but I was particularly interested in seeing the differences when we were working with the visual images. Now, with this particular audience, I don't have to say very much about haiku because I'm sure you're all very well aware of it. And Linda, I really enjoyed your presentation on the weekend with Annette, and I think that there will be some interesting questions about that relationship that move into thoughts about haiku. So we could see a certain continuum between how does the haiku respond to the visual image, and on one end of that, spectrum is to complete independence. And what we set out to do was let that visual image be a starting point, let it be a stimuli, and let the poem be completely free and independent and have its own imaginative white space. But the other end of the spectrum is that interesting imaginative entanglement when something happens and the poem and the visual image start to have some kind of synergy. And I think sometimes that happened. So I'm just going to give you examples of both of those extremes. And I think in looking at this, I learned a lot about certain things about haiku. Now, so I'm going to start with Brad's poem that we started this whole the whole slideshow with, and it was my photograph from my backyard, and it's the tree with rain and with the bowl. And what's interesting to me is that this to me teaches a bit about how haiku isn't description. Haiku is a kind of enactment. And so I think when you read Brad's haiku, lamplight, a bowl of rainwater for the birds. It's interesting because lamplight, first of all, exists by itself. It's a fragment followed by a cut. It's a kind of miniature let there be light moment in the poem. The lamplight illuminates a bowl full of rainwater, and rainwater becomes a kind of metonymy for the whole mood and sensory ambience of a rainy night. There's a sense of something aesthetically intentional. There's a lamp set outside to create a mood with a certain kind of elegance. There's a little bit of a wabe feeling, which is intensified as it's absorbed into the accidental, unintentional feeling of an empty bowl filling with rainwater for the birds. And yet there are no birds. It's evening. The emptiness is reopened. There's a kind of balancing in this poem, I feel, between light and dark, fullness and emptiness, the human and the non-human, that emerges in the poem. And so to me, this is the poem that needs its white space. It needs its freedom from the image. Plaster it up against the image, and I think what happens is it flattens out. And to me, this shows in a way the ways in which haiku is not description, that it creates a space, it creates a reality of its own. Now, an interesting contrasting example is the photograph of the crushed blossom. Again, this is an image from my backyard. It's kind of late spring, and it's a red bud blossom that's been crushed by a boot. And there he writes, "Day moon, her long sleeves hide the bruises." The haiku is complete in itself. It doesn't need the photograph, but something complex happens. There's a synergy that happens here that to me approximates haiku. And I think it is that somehow the poem creates an interrogation of eroticism, cruelty, and there's a kind of gendered consciousness that comes with that long sleeves, which for all of us will trigger ideas of classic Japanese poetry. So there's something here, there's an ambiguity of a delicate transparency and a fleshly density back into the color and the texture of the blossoms in the photo. There's really something very dynamic that happens between them, I think. So that's one dimension, was just thinking about this relationship. And then one of the techniques that we came to see, I think, is that a lot of times we're working very cinematically, with the sense of zooming in and zooming out. And a place where I think we can see contrasting versions of that is one of Kristen's photographs from Camden, Maine. It's that icy harbor scene. And it's at a distance, so it's difficult to find any single detail to enter the image. It's very cold. There's no human life stirring in the image. In fact, there's no natural life stirring. It's really, the colors are gray and blue, and there's that one bright red that flashes. And Jeannie, in her haiku, I think, uses imagination as a kind of tool to break through the surface of the image. It's like a camera mounted on a drone that kind of drops down and drills through, almost like cutting an ice core. She writes, "Deep in the frozen harbor, so many secrets." To me, it's interesting that she kind of captures the whole sensory quality of the harbor in one sweep. And that harbor becomes a kind of metonymy for all the stories of the occupants of the seaside town, past and present. And to me, there's definitely a film noirish feeling about that. Like, what are those secrets? I'm almost imagining like a suitcase full of cocaine, or maybe their body parts just my own kind of scary imagination kind of enters into it. On the other hand, Tom's poem responds to that forbidding emptiness by pulling back. His haiku embodies all those resistant elements by imagining the whole scene inside the glass of a snow globe. So he writes, "You can't go in, fingerprints on our snow globe." It's an act of imaginative erasure. Ironically, the haiku moment is created out of a disconnection with the image. The poem translates a frustration with trying to penetrate this kind of dehumanized image by shifting to the sense of touch. The haiku has a kind of playful doubleness. The scene is made familiar with our snow globe, but the haiku leaves the marks of its imaginative struggle, the fingerprints. So another approach, and this, I think this goes back to the presentation on Haiga, is to introduce into the scene images, either natural images, artificial images, or characters into the scene. And some examples of this might be a rattlesnake, a hawk, a wind chime, the sound of vespers, the smell of beeswax candles. You'll recognize that in all of those photographs, the haiku poet had introduced these other elements to make something, to create a link, to create a kind of charge in the poem. Also characters. Tom added a visiting nurse in a haiku about an amaryllis. Kristen imagines a transformation of a superhero, all to kind of crack the image open. I'm going to go to, I think, one of the more interesting examples of introducing a character is Paul's poem with the root on the woodland walk. If we could get a hold of that image. It's interesting. Here's Paul's haiku. Widower's walk, an exposed root points home. The suggestion of grief gives the simple, empty, wooded image an intentional focus. The widower searches for quiet contemplation and escape, perhaps from inward brooding. The root, innocuous enough in the visual image, comes to suggest not just a kind of road marker, but a metaphor for the loss. And the phrase exposed root suddenly suggests an aching root of a tooth. Another seaside harbor scene, now in summer, is the one that Hannah responded to. So Hannah's poem adds the soft serve ice cream vendor. And that element, here is Hannah's poem, soft serve at the wharf, a sloop coming in on evening wind. That added element tunes all the sensory elements of the moment. That silky softness to the tongue and the pleasurable coolness links with the smooth, subtle movement of the sloop and the wind. And of course, all those S sounds contribute to the way the elements unite in one sensory emotional moment. And now I'm going to think a little bit more about how sound enters into some of these visual images with one of Alan's poems. And this is an image of a church in the evening with a kind of a brass steeple. And Alan writes, Kingston sunset, the ratio of copper to tin in the church bell. It's like a discerning musician's ear listening to this, looking at this copper steeple and hearing the bell. And there's also a kind of synesthesia as the sunset and the coppery sound blur together. I want to jump to Kristen's poem about the island goats, because there she brings in a whole dimension of sound in response to that enigmatic image of farmers urging the group of goats and kids aboard the rowboat. Her poem reads, Island farm, the irregular foghorn of goats. Again, I think it's really interesting that the haiku actually erases the photograph in order to get at the fog and the surrounding water where the sound can flourish. So finally, I'm going to turn to one of the passages that Brad brought us to respond to, and that is the passage from Sonia Sanchez, which had probably more different responses, and I'm just going to look at two of them to end. The passage, "This is our time, a modern time. It's where the haiku can smell of gasoline as opposed to flowers. It will smell of death quite as often as opposed to life that might be in a stream." It will tell of death of rivers as opposed to someone sitting on the bank fishing. So Brad writes, tripping over a raccoon's skull, low day moon. And what strikes me is how Brad's poem kind of turns away from what we think of as a pastoral tradition, where wild nature is appreciated from the comfortable sophistication of the urban world and often sentimentalized. The dead raccoon is neither entirely in the world of wild nature or in the domestic world. It hovers in between. And the implicit metaphor between the low moon and the skull, for me, lowers the threshold of the uncanny and brings death uncomfortably close. It's more immediate and personal than, say, a snake skeleton or a cow skull. On the other hand, my response to the passage was to kind of catch on that sense of the death of rivers. And I wrote, numberless as grains of sand, an archipelago of plastic beads. This is in response to the sinking of a cargo ship off Indonesia a few weeks ago that was completely filled with plastic beads used to make plastic bags. And so tons of these beads washed up on the shore. You might recognize the opening line comes from Isaiah, so it's a biblical passage. Numberless as grains of sand is supposedly God's promise to his chosen people that they would flourish and multiply, obviously used ironically here. So this is just a sampling of some of the interesting kinds of juxtapositions I think we all noticed and learned from as we watched each other work. And I hope it was interesting to you to see these different kinds of moves and different approaches that we took. Thank you.
Thanks, Judson. I think that's it for us. I'd like to thank everyone for having us here and letting us share this, our work in the presentation and our process. Susan, I'll turn it back over to you. If you want to see if any questions, or I mean, we're a small group, so I don't think we have to use the chat, but your call.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. That was just amazing. I'm going to leave it recording for a little bit longer because I have the feeling people might have questions and it might be nice to capture those on the recording. I'll start off with a question. I'm curious just how you felt responding to text rather than image. I noticed that was sort of a new thing that wasn't there when I saw it the first time. So I thought that was really interesting and some fantastic work came out of those. So I'm just wondering if anyone has anything to say about that.
Brad, do you want to take a shot?
Yeah, sure. And then people can jump in. We tried two forms of text. One was short prose, short pieces of prose that Tom had picked out. And then we tried some quotes that I had collected. And these are quotes that I had collected for many years that I thought informed haiku. And so some of them are not by haiku writers, but by other folks that I felt informed the haiku process. So I found that the prose versus the quotes, were two very different processes for me. And I found myself going to kind of the concrete imagery of the prose and sticking fairly close to that, versus the quotes, I think really were opened up for me, and it sent me in a variety of directions. So for me, I found the quotes much more interesting than the prose, and easier to work with than the prose. But I'm sure some of my colleagues felt differently. But it was really different from looking at an image or a video. And so I think, you know, when Judson talks about completely independent versus entanglement and synergy, I think you can get a more Haiga-like interaction between the quotes and the poems, at least for me.
Yeah, I think for the some of the longer prose, some were very long paragraphs, and they often came with, I felt, a point of view. Whereas I think the quote, the little snippets that, you know, from Sanchez and the other ones, they were just little thoughts that you could leap off of instead of, and there wasn't necessarily a very strong point of view in there that kind of led you in a certain way. Whereas some of the longer prose passages would talk about nature and then kind of interpret it for you. And I felt like I was fighting against that perspective.
Yeah, I think with the longer passages of prose, which were primarily fiction, if I remember right, it was writing a haiku in response was almost like, for me at least, was like capping a haibun. I mean, it was, you weren't really trying to create something completely new out of it. You were more responding to it, but in that linking, shifting way when you're writing a haibun. I think it was definitely a different challenge to that exercise.
I agree with you, Kristen. It is definitely more haibun-like, and I preferred it. My favorite, the prose parts, the fiction was my favorite thing to respond to out of images and the short quotes even. Because of that, I would kind of get into a dreamlike state of whatever the writer was saying. And then to come up with something that played off of that was really very fun for me and pleasurable. And I think my brain might have already been in linguistic mode, which made it easier than trying to leap from image to words, to poetry.
I think one thing that came out for me, and especially thinking about this, was that in writing, it's not only the additive imagination of linking to something new, but it's also erasure. That is, that we have to, the imagination also works by negation. It's almost like we have to erase a space for ourselves. And I think I found that a bit easier with the visual images than I did with the prose.
That's really interesting, Judson. It makes me think of the found poems that take a prose piece and scratch out everything but a few words. I think that's a good analogy. Yeah, for me with the longer prose pieces, I would kind of glom on to like Blueberries and then have my various associations with blueberries and go off there. And I love, Mary, your description of the dream state. I think you are like the queen of the dream state in response to these. Some of Mary's were just like, whoa, how did you get there? And Mary would be like, I don't know exactly. But yeah, so being able to make these sort of free associations. And for me with the quotes, what I ended up doing was I took a walk in the morning and then came back with kind of my notes and material in my notebook and the images and let the quotes guide me. And that worked really well. Because at first the quotes were so abstract that I had trouble finding my blueberries. So it was a different approach. But I think the variety has been stupendous. I think it really has kept our brains challenged. And like the Dutch paintings this month, I'm like, okay. But
Sorry.
that was great. I'm in love with Dutch painting now. It's so cool. So, and I think there's often that first moment of like, oh, geez, how am I going to do this? But you sort of get yourself into that accepting, open state, the same as you would when going for a walk or riding in a train and trying to get in that haiku space. But it's different, challenging to do it from home.
Well, I'm curious. I think one of the limitations of putting this presentation together was that we had to pick things that were you could readily put on a slide. And one of the prompts we did were short videos, and they were maybe 14 seconds long of, an otter sliding into the water, and then you'd switch to, a babbling brook or something like that. And those to me seem to have that same kind of dynamic between the image at one end and you lengthen that image out to be the video at the other, which in some ways was like the short quote versus the long quote. And I wonder how some of you felt about writing to the video. I found those the hardest because I couldn't really get a single perspective I could leap into. I felt like when I was starting to look at something, it would shift away to something else. I wonder if you guys had any thoughts on that.
I agree with you, Paul. I thought that was the hardest of our challenges. That was really difficult.
I had to watch them over and over and over to sort of find the access point. But yeah, it was definitely a challenge.
I think, it's ironic because when we're doing a physical ginkgo, that's what we're doing is we're watching, a video all the time, right? But I think the thing with those constructed videos is that they're edited, right? So you get a whole bunch of different clips. And so that, I think, made it a little challenging. We're also considering getting inspired by some music. That might be one of our next forays.
Well, I feel like you could keep coming back after, a period of months of all these interesting prompts. It's
Well, I
wonderful.
think we have put through we put in an application to present at HNA, because I feel like with their theme of Ma and space, and Judson, talked about this, there is very much a space between all of us and the image, and then the individual poem and the image. And I think there's a lot to work with there. And in between now and then, we have Dutch paintings, we have, music, who knows what we're going to do next. So yeah, it's been a very challenging but very enjoyable process to kind of approach things from a different angle than maybe you would otherwise. And I love seeing other people write things that I would never even think of making those kinds of switches they do.
It's also kind of nicely leveling in a way as a group, because that we've all had that moment of, oh, geez, what am I going to do with this? And so it creates this sense of sort of trust and lovingness of like, okay, whatever you came up with, we're up for it. So I think it has had an interesting kind of leveling of the playing field in a way. And you're just so surprised and appreciative of what people come up with.
It was interesting that early on in the process, I think I was less inclined to put out something I didn't think that was that great. And as we've gone through this, for a year now, I think we're all much more comfortable saying, I couldn't do anything with this image, and so I wrote this, and I don't like it. And I think there's a nice freedom there. I think the group is very supportive of that.
I think a couple people have mentioned this, but one of the most enjoyable parts of this process was seeing what other people come up with for the same image. And it was just delightful to watch that unfold.
And a little bit uncanny at times when a couple of people come up with the same thing or close to the same thing. Like there was one where Jeannie and I both came up with a connection about migrant workers. It was, or migrant children, or something like that, when we were responding to one of the quotes that Brad brought. And it was a positive quote about I'm not thinking of the right word, but when one ecosystem merges with another. And it was positive. It was a positive quote, but Jeannie and I both went to a political thing. So that was pretty cool,
In-person ginkgos, I've occasionally seen where two people will write exactly the same thing, exactly, not just kind of in the ballpark. And I think that's to be celebrated because, you're having the shared experience. Publishing them both is a trickier thing, but it's great to write them that way. It's fine.
So what's the future for your group, do you think? When you can get back in person, are you planning to keep this going? I know you have people who've moved far away.
Yeah, we're actually planning on a hybrid because we don't, some of the folks can't join us physically for a ginkgo easily or at all. So we're going to have a hybrid where sometimes we will be meeting physically for ginkgos, and at other times we'll keep the Zoomco model.
Mhm.
I was wondering if anybody else has tried any new ways to get inspired during COVID. Anybody else have ways you've tried over the last year?
I could offer something, but I'm not sure if it's a new way. I have this book called 14,000 Things to Be Happy About by Joanne Tipfer or something like that. And if you open it at random, almost anything, it's a naming of something, nouns and experiences. You could easily use it to inspire yourself to write haiku. And since there's 14,000 of them, that'll keep you going for a long time. And I used it once for the prompts for National Haiku Writing Month. And I continue to enjoy those sorts of random things. The trick being, don't invent something, make it trigger your memory so you can write authentically about it. And not every one of the prompts works, I'll tell you that too.
Actually, I have a question, not the new things, but when you do Zuku or Zoomku, when you do ginkgo, you write on the spot, right? Immediately. And when you're doing, using photos or maybe quotes or prose are maybe a little difficult, but for the photos, you guys write on the spot or you have photos beforehand and write it later?
We have them beforehand. We usually have them about, I think usually it's about 2 weeks. This time I think it's a little more than that.
I thought we might need more time with the paintings.
Okay, well,
Especially now I had to look at my calendar to see when the next meeting was.
The 11th.
And yeah, actually, question about those 72 seasons as well. It was a painting or it was a video? Because 72 seasons in Japanese have a very, very strange word. It's kigo, but it's very strange word on it. For
Yeah.
example, like rotten glass makes or becomes firefly kind of things, which is almost like what it calls a riddle. So I was wondering what it's based on some Japanese kigo or it's not?
It's an app.
It's an app. Yeah.
It's an app called 72 Seasons, so it's based on the Japanese kigo. Yeah.
Yeah, so here's actually the app right here. And so there's usually every week or so, there's a couple of things like this week, there's a picture of an apricot and it talks about apricots. Then there'll be, or this is actually plums, sorry, yellow plums. There'll be a haiku. Then there'll be, something seasonal. So there's about 5 or 6 things in each iteration of the 72 that have been very interesting to work with. And sometimes they're a little too abstract, but it's been very fascinating. And it makes you, I think, appreciate your own seasons locally, because I started thinking more granularly about how seasons change here in Florida of all places.
So it's based on, I forgot the woman's name. So it's based on the book the woman wrote in English about 72 seasons?
I don't think so.
No, okay.
Japanese. It's Japanese based.
It's Japanese based, but the American woman, I think, who used to be geisha woman, I forgot the name, but she wrote some 72 seasons. Well, I may not be right, so I will shut up.
I just put a link to the Apple app store link to it, and you can also get it for Android.
Thank you. I will take a look.
I think it's a free app too.
I think the book you may be talking about is this one. Yeah. East Wind Melts the Ice. Oh, there, Allison. Good. Eliza Dalton.
Yes. Eliza Dalton. She lives in
Eliza.
Berkeley, or at least I think lives in Berkeley.
Well, I'm going to stop the recording, but we can continue to talk. Thank you again, all of you, so much for coming and doing such a wonderful presentation. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you all for having us.
Yeah.